No problem. All right, great. Well, Carlos, Josh, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I am going to go ahead and share my screen. For those of you that have called in, you may not be able to see the slides that are going to come up. Everyone else, hopefully, though, should be able to see slides come up on the screen. So let me know if that's not the case. I won't spend too much time on the first few introductory slides because, as I said, Carlos gave a great introduction of Senate Bill SB 743 and its intent and history there. But let me just introduce myself. My name is Delia Votsch. I'm a senior engineer with Fehr and Peers. Jason Pack is also on the line. I'll let him introduce himself in a second. But as Josh mentioned, we've been working very closely for just over a year now with SBCTA and all of the member jurisdictions on local issues related to implementation of SB 743. So we're hoping to share that background and more of that information today. So Jason, if you wanted to just jump in and introduce yourself really quickly.
Yeah, so Jason Pack, I'm a principal with Fehr and Peers. Been living and working in the Inland Empire market for about 12 years now, and have been the principal on this project and working pretty closely with Delia and Josh and Steve over at SBCTA on this implementation study. I've also worked on the implementation pathway study that WRCOG produced for their local agencies. Which was in advance of this SBCTA effort. So I do think this effort benefited from that journey that we took a few years ago. And then also I do think the SBCTA effort has probably some of the more newer or latest and greatest information specifically related to implementation, since it has been done subsequent to the WRCOG effort.
Great. Thanks, Jason. All right, so we'll just dive right in. As I mentioned, these first few slides really give that overview of SB 743, which I think Carlos did a great job summarizing. This first slide just sort of notes that SB 743 is the latest in a long line of legislation from our state government, just sort of giving us more and more guidance for CEQA analysis. As Carlos mentioned, this law was signed in 2013, so it has been almost 7 years since that law was signed. However, the deadline to adopt it was July 1st, 2020. So that is why we are having a lot of these conversations right now. So what does SB 743 do? First and foremost, it eliminates level of service and delay as the metric for quantifying transportation impacts in a CEQA document and replaces LOS and delay with VMT. So we do have some guidance from the state on thresholds, on evaluating significant impacts, on calculating VMT, but there are still a lot of decisions and unanswered questions that cities and local agencies need to fill in for themselves. Carlos did also touch on this, but I will reiterate the three main legislative intents of SB 743 are to promote infill development, promote public health through active transportation, and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So it's really important when we're discussing SB 743 to remember that these three things are the legislative intent of this law, and that most decisions that we're going to be discussing really need to tie back to one of these three core intents. So I mentioned briefly timeline, signed into law 2013, July 1st, 2020 is when our opt-in period ends for switching from level of service to VMT. But an important note here that we just wanted to emphasize. So as of November 2018, we did get updated CEQA guidelines. And so there was, and Jason can jump in and give me the exact court case that determined this. We did see a ruling out of Sacramento that sort of showed us that really since that point in time, November 2018, all of our EIRs should not have been only using level of service for transportation impacts. So for about the last year and a half, any EIR that was produced really should have been looking at something. It didn't have to be VMT, but the court case, the case law told us that we needed to be looking at something in addition to level of service and needed to show why that was appropriate.
Yeah, so I'll just add on to that, Delia. So this stems from the actual legislation and what was codified through enacting the legislation. which did direct that upon finalization of the CEQA guidelines and adoption of the CEQA guidelines, that we can no longer use level of service as our only metric for evaluating impacts to the transportation system. So this actually ended up, like everything in CEQA, we typically rely on somebody challenging a CEQA document and having a judge interpret everything for us. But it was the City of Sacramento general plan challenge that where the judge did render a decision that reiterated the fact that after adoption of the CEQA guidelines back in November of 2018, we should not only be using level of service for identifying impacts. So it's an interesting nuance, since it put us in this time frame of then until July of 2020, which is when we have to switch over to VMT, where theoretically, based on the judgment and the CEQA guidelines, we could have been using anything other than level of service, but it's an important consideration, especially if you have ongoing projects.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Jason. So as far as, some big picture concerns regarding SB 743 when we're thinking about implementation, number one, we do lack the same consistent technical guidance that we have for level of service. So there's no equivalent of the highway capacity manual yet for VMT analysis. We do have a technical advisory that was issued by OPR that begins to give us some of that guidance, but there are still a lot of gaps in that technical understanding. Again, this is sort of the common lexicon, or essentially we have to kind of learn a new language to a certain extent when it comes to VMT. What is VMT per capita? What does that mean? Is that a rate? Is that a ratio? What's per capita? There's a lot of language and technical details that we're all going to have to learn. And this stuff does get pretty complicated pretty quickly. And then lastly, the tools that we have to calculate VMT, the regional travel models, sketch planning and spreadsheet tools, there are some pretty big limitations and challenges in using those. And there's also just the fact that there are a lot of CEQA practitioners out there that aren't familiar with calculating VMT. They've done level of service for years and years, and they're just not familiar with this methodology yet. So there's, again, just that learning curve that's really taking place. So jumping into local decisions, local agencies, primarily cities, what do they need to do here? There's a number of decisions that they need to make. So first of all, every decision related to SB 743 implementation and the adoption of VMT must be founded in substantial evidence. So because, I feel like we're all turning a little bit into lawyers here when we start talking CEQA, right? Because this is related back to CEQA, and there is a pretty strong, not just strong, there, as Jason mentioned, things will be litigated and sorted out in the courts. Any decision needs to be based in substantial evidence. So there needs to be facts behind those decisions. The city decisions also need to support the legislative intent of SB 743, which we already talked about. And always the challenge for every city is balancing the state guidance with their local context, goals, and values. So we did want to talk about project screening. So the tool that we produce for SBCTA is sort of captured here in this image. So this is a web-based tool that will be accessible to the public, to anyone. And this will allow people to determine if a project can be screened from VMT analysis. So there are actually 4 criteria that you need to look at when looking at project screening. There are 2 of those 4 screening criteria captured in this tool. So the first is a TPA, or a transit priority area. And it might be a little hard to see in this image because of the color, but if you see that kind of light orange, yellow sort of color on the map, that's a transit priority area. That's a half mile from a major transit stop or a high quality transit route, which is defined as a bus route with 15-minute or less headways. So projects that fall within a TPA can be screened from VMT analysis. The second screening criteria is what we call low VMT generating screening. Those are all the squares, or the TAZs, I should say, that are shown in blue on this screen. So those are areas where the VMT that's being generated today is more efficient or lower than the average. It's below, in this case, we have selected the county as the average in the tool. These are more efficient than the county as a whole. So projects that fall within those zones could also be screened from analysis. Cities can also choose to screen based on project type. So for example, local serving uses such as retail under 50,000 square feet could be screened, and also projects that generate a low number of trips would also be possible to be screened. So we're going to now walk through one of the more substantial deliverables. This is really a key deliverable for our the local jurisdictions with the SBCTA that we produced. So this is what we're calling the city decision checklist. So this we've gone through this with pretty much almost every city at this point within SBCTA's members, and we have walked them through. These are the decisions that they need to make to implement SB 743. So we've already kind of talked about the first two steps on this slide. That's screening criteria. Cities can choose to deviate from the daily trip threshold and land use types that were recommended by the state. The state recommended 110 daily trips. Cities can deviate from this. However, again, they would need to show substantial evidence as to why that's appropriate.
And Delia, pardon me,
Yes.
this is Andy Henderson for the BIA.
Hi.
Hi. We've seen some cities choose a higher threshold for daily trips, 300 or so.
Right.
And I just wondered, could you expound a little bit on the type of substantial evidence that would be sufficient or at least plausible for
Right.
supporting a particular number that's higher?
Absolutely. Great question. Thanks, Andy. Yeah, so we would want that substantial evidence to really show local data, ideally, from existing developments within the city that show the, a development of a certain type and a certain size generating this many trips is generating VMT lower than our average. So this is a non-impactful project. So that would require probably going out and collecting some traffic data, some traffic counts, and also probably looking at the trip lengths of that existing development. So again, they would kind of need to have the data to back that up and say, we've identified this many sites throughout our city. We are showing that they are generating less VMT than our average, and they are generating 300 daily trips, to your example, on average. Therefore, we've made the conclusion that projects with 300 daily trips or fewer could be screened out. So there does need to be some data to back that up.
I'll just add to that this 110 daily trips is actually what's in the OPR technical advisory, and they tie it back to a CEQA exemption specifically tied to that 10,000 square feet of office. So that's the substantial evidence that they're using. Other jurisdictions that I've seen, San Jose has a higher daily trip count. They actually went out and purchased some big data using cell phone records and the like to really track how big developments need to get before they become a little bit more of a regional serving use as opposed to local serving. And that's what they use to really provide that substantial evidence. There are some other jurisdictions, particularly in a county southwest of San Bernardino, let's say, that when they were looking at increasing this, we kind of pressed them as to, well, what substantial evidence did you guys use to justify? In that case, they were using 250 daily trips. And they responded with, well, it just kind of felt about right. So we would not suggest the it felt about right approach, but like what San Jose did, where if you go out and you're able to collect some data and really provide some level of fact to support whatever screening criteria is used to help really reinforce the local serving nature of those size projects would be something you would want to consider under that.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Jason.
And the recommendation of 110 daily trips, if it was based on offices, and the OPR recommendation,
Hey,
if you
how's
if
it
you need
going?
substantial evidence to
You got a minute?
Hi, I think someone may be unmuted.
Yeah, I'm working on this SD Homes project, just trying to get my head wrapped around it. And
hello.
Yeah, hi,
Just
Andy.
I did, but it's okay. You can keep going.
Yes, thanks, Jason.
Anyways, this was Andy. I was just wondering if you settle on this 110 daily trips, do you need substantial evidence to demonstrate that that's at all applicable to your community, or does everyone just give a pass on that? Because it sounds like it kind of came from a far away, application if it was related to offices, and this screening threshold relates to perhaps other types of projects.
Yeah, so it is tied directly to that CEQA exemption that's offered for that 10,000 square foot office development scenario. I will say that OPR has received some level of criticism for using that for developing the 110 daily trip screening, mostly because number of trips generated is only half of the VMT equation, and it discounts the length of those trips. And as I tell people, 110 trips driving 200 miles is a lot different than 110 trips driving 5 miles. And the OPR guidance just is not reflective of that. So some of the jurisdictions we're working with have opted to use some average trip length information coming from statewide household survey data to kind of back into a VMT screening criteria. And what we found specifically in San Bernardino County is if we do that, and then it's a little extra calculation, but when we do that and then we look at local trip lengths and back into a development envelope, if you will, you actually are getting a little bit higher yield on development. Delia, you'll have to help me with this. I want to say it's on the order of magnitude of maybe 40% or 30% more development than if we typically just use the daily trips identified by OPR.
Yeah, that's right, Jason. That's right.
Yeah, so these are all things that we're walking through with the local agencies, and I think the key consideration that they're trying to make is, I think everybody agrees it makes sense to screen out small projects. I think the key thing that's resonating with local agencies as we discuss this is they're struggling with defensibility combined with trying to make it as easy as possible, combined with trying to screen as many projects as possible. And unfortunately, those three priorities don't land on the single approach on this.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where we're walking through some of these agencies and engaging in those conversations to hopefully help them make an informed decision.
All right. Thank you. Sorry for so much focus on this one issue. Thank you.
No, we appreciate the questions because we do want to make sure we're addressing the questions and concerns that this group has. So thank you for that. Okay, great. So screening decisions there, talked through daily trips, the potential to use a VMT screening, definitely a lot to consider there. Similar with step 2, which is based on land use type. Similar conversation here around, what is a local serving land use type. We have heard from some local jurisdictions that we're working with that assembly uses, so churches and community institutions that could be local serving. Hotels is another one that has come up as a potentially, in some cases, local serving land use. So this list is kind of evolving, and again, the definition of what is local serving really does depend on the jurisdiction, the land use type, and even the project type. So moving on to step 3, this is where we get
quick question, Delia.
Oh, please go ahead.
The list there, is there any context you could unpack for us about the listing of affordable housing amongst those on the current list?
Sure, and Jason may have to jump in to help me out with this. This does come from the OPR Technical Advisory, which lists affordable housing as a project type that could be screened from VMT analysis. Jason, could you jump in with any other details on that?
No, I think the biggest question we get on affordable housing is if I do 10% affordable, can I be screened? And I think when OPR created this, it was really under the guise that there is substantial evidence out there that if you put in affordable housing, people tend to have lower auto ownership. Within their household, they tend to drive less, typically because their income's lower, among other factors. So there is that substantial evidence that supports that, but it would need to be a full affordable housing project, as opposed to 10, 20, 30% of your project being dedicated towards affordable housing. So I think the big thing for any of these is just that substantial evidence or having that data that backs it up. The other thing that has come up in some of our discussions with this would be senior housing as defined by HUD as being exempt. And similarly, there is some research out there related to senior housing and less trip gen associated with those types of units relative to standard housing units. So those are all things that local agencies are also requesting to be added into their guidelines or thinking about adding into their own guidelines as we talk about this with them.
Yeah, great.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jason. Great. Any other questions on land use types before we move on to the really technical stuff here?
No.
All right. Great. And also questions at the end are also welcome. So, okay, yeah, as I mentioned, we're getting very technical. We're getting deep into regional travel models right now. So I'm going to try to keep this as high level as I can. This is a pretty important distinction, though, for everyone to understand and for cities to have a consistent methodology when calculating VMT. So there are multiple ways that we can extract VMT from a regional travel model. And so two of those methods are the PA method, productions and attractions, and the OD method, origin destination. The big thing to understand here is that production and attractions can be separated by trip purpose. So we can isolate commuting trips, commute VMT, home base work VMT. We can isolate home base VMT. We can isolate the VMT by trip purpose. When we look at OD VMT, we cannot isolate by trip purpose, but for OD VMT, we can include trips that start and end outside the model boundary. So in parts of San Bernardino County, this is pretty critical. We have trips coming from Kern County, outside Imperial County, outside of our model boundary. So the other key point with OD method is this is the same calculation method used in the other sections of the EIR. So your energy, your air quality, your GHG calculations use the OD VMT. So it can be very helpful to have a consistent VMT calculation throughout your EIR. The other option here that cities can consider is sort of the both method, which we've kind of evolved a little bit in how we're presenting that. It's really default to OD, but consider PA method in specific cases, because what's challenging about the OD method is that since you cannot isolate by trip purpose, when you have a single use, particularly a single use commercial project, it can be challenging to mitigate your VMT unless you look at the PA method. So most jurisdictions we're working with are really leaning towards using the OD method that sort of default to OD. So you have that consistent number, you're factoring in trips that start and end outside the model boundary, but you do also then consider the PA method when you need that calculation done to mitigate certain kinds of projects. So again, very technical. Sorry, go ahead.
Delia, this is Andy Henderson again. I understand that if you take any given hypothetical locality, that there will be necessarily differences between these two approaches, particularly the PA and the OD. Mm-hmm. What discretion does the jurisdiction have? Let's take two hypothetical jurisdictions. One sort of wants to go full steam ahead in terms of the, sort of regulatory imperative of cutting VMT, and the other leans more towards accommodating new growth and community development. Would those two communities have sort of plenary discretion to say, well, we're going to pick one or the other based on our leanings? Or is there some more sort of prescriptive imperative behind this thing that forces them to choose one or the other. So that's sort of the question.
Yeah, I think it's a really good.
How much discretion does a locality have to sort of either say, well, we want to take a light approach to this, so we're going to pick PA or something, for example?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. And I think it really does come a little more into play when we're talking about thresholds so much as methodology. I think, though, to kind of restate a little bit what we've already said, but reinforce, local jurisdictions do have that discretion to kind of figure out where on that scale they want to lie between, really, really enforcing that state target and reducing GHGs versus being very light and encouraging development. They do have some discretion on where they want to fall in that spectrum. But again, wherever they fall, they have to show substantial evidence as to why that's appropriate and how it supports the legislative intent of SB 743. So one of those intents is reducing GHGs. So you would need to be able to show that maybe you don't meet the state target, but you're still supporting the overall intent of reducing GHGs. And Jason, I don't know if you wanted to add to that.
I'll add in specifically to this methodology question that you're asking on step 3. To Delia's point, the methodology specifically, I don't think is as critical in, say, being more supportive or less supportive of specific types of development. In my mind, the methodology and the methodology you choose is more of a jurisdictional decision on the completeness of your VMT estimates. So as Delia talked about, the technical advisory is pretty clear that you should do a full accounting of your VMT and not artificially truncated and arbitrary boundaries. So the fact that any of your trips that begin or end outside the model area aren't even included in a PA type of assessment, in my mind, that's pretty clearly inconsistent with the technical advisory, and I'm not sure how a judge would respond if you were ever to get challenged on that fact. Clearly, OD is a little bit more inclusive of all VMT, and we think BOD's probably a little bit better if you were to get challenged. And then on top of it, the OD being consistent with your GHG, energy, air quality VMT estimates. We think that there's probably some value in that if you were to ever get challenged on this, having consistent VMT numbers throughout those 4 sections of your environmental document. So in my mind, the methodology is more of a function of consistency, defensibility, and then also recognizing that there are limitations with each of these measures that you would clearly want to describe in the methodology write-up of any environmental document. Since none of these methods is perfect, just the OD is a little more accurate, I think, than the PA method, given what it accounts for.
Do the defensibility risks that you just described apply equally when you're considering the choice between these methodologies for a particular project, as opposed to the application of the choice between these methodologies when you're looking at establishing a threshold of significance at a local level? In other words, we understand vaguely, at least, that under CEQA there is discretion to set the threshold at the local level. And do all those indefensibility problems exist in connection with that, or is there more discretion when setting a threshold of significance to take latitude in choices along these lines?
Yeah, so to that point, I do think that the threshold of significance will give you a little bit more latitude as long as you're backing it with substantial evidence as to why you chose that threshold. I think this methodology question, I'll go back to the good old days when we were doing level of service analysis. I remember working on environmental documents where we were trying to establish study area, and just the lack of discretion really in identifying is 5 miles out regional project good enough. And kind of that methodology component of it, and the judge's ruling on that seemed to be much more challengeable than a level of service threshold identified by a specific agency.
Jason, just a quick follow-up. If cities are looking for flexibility, would opting into both allow them to look project by project as to whether or not they want to apply the PA or the OD, understanding you need substantial evidence in either or, but just a simple view of giving cities the discretion and flexibility. Is that a way to interpret selecting both, that you could then take the PA and the OD and look at it project by project?
Yeah, I think the flexibility is good for jurisdictions. I think what might trip you up if you were to get challenged would be if you were applying it kind of on an ad hoc basis. For this, maybe single family housing development, we used OD, and the other one, and the next one we used PA. I think that might you open to some terms relating challenged. But I think using the both, and the way most jurisdictions I think are looking at it is, use OD for most everything, but specific projects like an industrial project or a logistics project, where maybe it makes more sense to just focus in on that home-based work commute trip and recognize kind of the interstate commerce concerns with VMT for logistics development. Maybe that's a better place to really focus in on that PA method and really hone in on that home-based work trip and focus in on the mitigation specifically for that. So that's where most of the agencies are, I'd say, leaning as we've been having some of these conversations. But I think you'd want to at least standardize it or make it consistent, so it's just not, the methodology doesn't change project by project to get a desired outcome.
Yeah.
Sorry to ask another question, Andy Henderson again, but just quickly, it seems to me that if the regulatory imperative is directional and the direction is reducing per capita VMT, and is it the case that every choice you have to make, that it seems to me that you're going to have to be explaining why you didn't choose the option when you have a choice between two options, why you didn't choose the one that furthers the directional imperative. So it's always going to be the case if you're facing two options, that one is going to go further in the direction of the imperative and the other less far. So how do you ever justify taking the choice that goes less far in the direction of the regulatory imperative?
Yeah, and Andy, I'm not sure that's really the case with PA and OD. I don't think that we've seen, and Jason, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think we've really seen that one methodology versus the other really does further, like as you said, the legislative intent of SB 743 more than the other. I would say they're kind of neutral in that sense.
Yeah, I think the bigger question comes in on the threshold on that.
Yeah.
And remember, I think to Delia's point, when say you are using PA, VMT as your methodology, because we're developing the average that you're comparing it to at the citywide or the county level, using the exact those inherent biases tied into the methodology will be carried into both the average setting that you're benchmarking to, as well as your project level assessment.
Yeah.
So again, that's why I think the methodology is important to try and standardize as best you can,
right.
But recognize that the threshold component and what you're benchmarking yourself to is probably the one that you want to make a clear decision on.
Yeah, and I'm going to suggest we actually move to our next slide, because that does cover the benchmark and threshold options that Jason was just starting to discuss, which I think is really where a lot of these questions really congregate, is around setting your regional benchmark and then ultimately setting your threshold of significance. So, I mean, Jason did just discuss it. I think we've been showing cities the option to benchmark themselves either to themselves at the city level or at the county level. OPR does allow you to set a regional benchmark at the discretion to set your own regional benchmark, and so we have given both of those options. Thresholds, this really is the biggie, and this is where a lot of these questions again really do congregate around. We have these 4 options that we've put together. They have also been reviewed by CEQA attorneys as part of our work with SBCTA. So, and each individual city is going to have to review how this looks in their city. But the 4 options are to rely on the OPR technical advisory. This threshold would be 15% below existing. The second option is to rely on statewide GHG reduction targets, which The math ends up being quite similar to option 1, 14.3% below existing, but it's just a slightly different source for your reduction target. Option 3 is to set your threshold based on the performance of your city in the RTP SCS horizon year based on your general plan build out. So that is to say we would look into the future. 2040 is our current RTP SCS horizon year. So we would look at 2040 and see how is the VMT in that city in 2040 and compare to that. And then option 4 is to set your threshold based on your performance today, how the city is performing today, and you would need to just be better than existing. So Jason, did you want to add anything to that discussion of benchmarks and thresholds?
Yeah, and I think what we've heard loud and clear from the CEQA attorneys is that they believe any of these 4 options could be defensible if challenged. I think what they have reiterated is that whichever threshold you choose, you do have to back it with with substantial evidence for the record as to why it's an appropriate threshold for your city. And I think one of the key things on that is even option 1, which I'll say is usually the most aggressive of any of the thresholds, the 15% below existing, consistent with the OPR recommendation. That was developed based on state guidelines and a state VMT reduction target. And as we found out with the Golden Door case, as well as one of the more recent Newhall cases, is that reliance on a state target isn't necessarily applicable for a local threshold unless you provide that substantial evidence as to why it's appropriate for determining your local threshold. So as jurisdictions are kind of going through these, they're wrestling with what can you use for substantial evidence, what makes sense. We have one city in San Bernardino County where actually their general plan build out and 15% below existing end up being almost the exact same number. So that's fun to try and kind of get your head around substantial evidence to a threshold on when 2 of these options basically produce the same result. The other thing I will also note is that Caltrans is working on guidance, and they've produced what they call their TISG, or Traffic Impact Study Guidelines, which is essentially what Caltrans staff will be using as they do their responsible agency reviews through the IGR process, or intergovernmental review process of development projects in all the local agencies. And their guidance that they've produced to date essentially is doubling down on option 1, if you will, on the state level, and recommending that Caltrans projects related to that 15% below existing threshold, essentially creating a Caltrans threshold for IGR consideration. So that's another option or another perspective I think some of our local agencies are taking when looking at this as to how they're ultimately going to respond to those nastygrams that we've all seen from Caltrans come in on our development projects, and responding to those comments accordingly.
And just Andy Henderson again, quickly. Obviously, option 4 is the lighter touch and more lenient. And when you look at step 4, the choice between city and county is going to, theoretically, a particular city could choose the city option when it's a lighter touch. What substantial evidence would justify that sort of thing where it's kind of clear that they're choosing an option that results in less VMT reduction in the threshold selection context? Is it just the deference that they get, or is there some quantum of substantial evidence that they need to muster to show that it works for them or that it's justifiable?
Yeah, so I'll give you so we did ask this very question to the CEQA attorney that we had specifically advising on this specific project. And the guidance that she had prepared was essentially, I call it the four-step part to defining substantial evidence. So from her discussion, it was number 1, when you take this to your council, you're going to need to define what the threshold is. 2, you're going to have to identify what informed that threshold. So a lot of this information that we've put together for SBCTA really is helping the jurisdictions in identifying all the information that they looked at to inform their decision. Step 3 is looking at what facts went into the decision. So one of the documents that we did produce was project testing and essentially sample projects being run for a variety of jurisdictions. So the thought of looking at how all that worked based on all 4 of these potential options was part of what you could use in assisting with those facts. Other things like looking at your general plan policies, how supportive of the intents of the legislation. All those things is what they looked at as potential substantial evidence for that. And then finally, their final step 4 was tying it all back to the intent of the 743 legislation. And keep in mind, OPR, when they set their 15% below, that was primarily to reduce greenhouse gas emissions at the state level. That's only one of the intents of SB 743. So the other 2 were promoting active transportation as well as promoting infill development. So I think if you were to set any, I'll call it alternative options, if you will, from what OPR had presented, as long as you kind of walk through that process and provide the facts, whatever you can do to rely on any information in your general plan, those are all supportive of whatever threshold that you would potentially adopt under this.
Sounds like you would probably also want to state your policy reasoning and hope that gets deference. But anyways, that's a very helpful discussion. Thank you, Jason.
Sure. Yeah. And it's something all the jurisdictions are struggling with. So it's a very good, I think they're all trying to balance this. What does our general plan say? What if we planned what's in the RTP SCS, which ultimately determines our air quality conformity, which is a pretty big deal. And trying to be as development friendly as possible. I think those are kind of the strings, if you will, that the agencies are struggling with and trying to figure out the best way to combine those to create a threshold that they feel is defensible and appropriate.
Quick question, Jason. I know as part of the deliverables you had prepared in concert with the Transportation Authority were some threshold models under the OD and the PA. So you were inquiring or mentioning the ID to threshold, what informed the threshold, what facts went into that decision. When a city takes a look at the deliverables that accompanied these steps, and they are hypothetically take a city that has an OD VMT threshold, the county, let's say 32 VMT, and they're 34 or 35. Let's say they're above that. Is essentially the thought that they need to get under that county number or getting under their threshold. So if their threshold's 35 on VMT, based on the modeling that you guys provided, are they just responsible to get under 35 and not get to that county average reduction level?
Yeah, so it all depends on, I'll go back to that step 4 and what you're using to benchmark yourself against. Originally, when the original set of OPR tech guidance came out, actually back in 2015, they suggested that all jurisdictions in an MPO benchmark against the MPO boundary or the MPO average. And that created a lot of angst, especially here in Southern California, where we're all part of the SCAG MPO. And LA dominates all of the metrics in the MPO region by virtue of the amount of population that's centered there, that there was no way anywhere outside of LA would be able to benchmark themselves to LA or to the region because of LA's influence. So OPR, as they went through this process and received feedback, they did expand that out to really identify a regional average or a city average. And I think that was in reflection that there are areas, especially in the MPO, like a SCAG, we have very specific areas of San Bernardino County that are very rural and are very not LA. And to hold them to that same VMT efficiency average is just, well, it's ludicrous. So that's why that benchmark against your city or the county is an important consideration to make before you get to this threshold options from that perspective.
How should cities interpret then as they have received those deliverables from you with their respective city under the OD, VMT, or PA for that matter, but just speaking to the OD, if they look at the bar that says county average and they're below it already, then is their VMT reduction responsibility to just get under their respective VMT for their city if they're already under the county average?
Yeah, so I'll suggest that most jurisdictions we've talked to are defaulting to the higher of the two VMT benchmarks. So if their city is higher than the county, they're defaulting to themselves. If the county ends up being higher than the city, then they're typically defaulting to the county and providing I'll call it the argument or the position that, hey, if we're more efficient than the rest of the county, isn't it environmentally a superior idea to develop here instead of elsewhere in the county? And that's what we're seeing most of the cities make their determination based on.
Thank you.
I would suggest, though, that if you did go through that and say you wanted to choose option 4 and you were benchmarking option, or if you're using option 4 as your threshold and benchmarking to the county, if your city is, say, 15% below the county already, but you're choosing option 4, I think that's where we get into the if you're so much better than the county already, why are you setting such a lenient threshold? And I think that's part of the nuanced discussion that is occurring with some jurisdictions as we go through this.
Yeah.
Kind of what's the substantial evidence to essentially allow an increase in VMT in our city of 15%?
Yep.
But if a city is desiring to, because of the challenges of RENA, and frankly, I'd be hard pressed to identify any city that in our county that has met their current RENA cycle goals and objectives, and they're really focusing on that goal, and they're already 15% below county average. I think it'd be hard pressed to say, why are we being asked to do any more when these other cities are not as we're putting ourselves at a competitive disadvantage. So those who would want a lighter touch in that kind of scenario, what say you on how they approach that? Is I would think those cities would want to minimize as much as possible what they're asking of the development community.
Sure. No, I totally understand that perspective. So, and yeah, I think that's part of the struggle that all these agencies are doing. And, you know, it's not just all about housing either. It does include all other land use developments within their jurisdiction. So it's an interesting conversation and a complicated one that jurisdictions are undertaking to try and set this. And I'll also add that unfortunately, like everything in CEQA, some judge is ultimately going to determine this through a challenge through the court system. So there is the very real possibility that some judge may determine that options wasn't defensible, similar to what happened with that recent Newhall case related to emissions. So we try and make our best effort, get our attorneys to provide as much input as possible, and then have some judge determine it at a later date, like everything in CEQA.
We try to avoid the courts as much as possible because of the delays that are therein, but understand. Sorry, I think I might have cut someone off there who was going to comment.
No, this is Sandy. Jason, quick question for you. Under option 3, are we looking at reductions in the general plan, or are we looking at the future model project versus future per capita VMT from the general plan? The reason I'm asking this is, you know, there are some jurisdictions where the future VMT per capita is higher than now.
Yeah, Jason, I can answer this. That's okay. Sandy, you're exactly right. That's absolutely true. There are some cities where their 2040, their general plan build out VMT is higher than their existing VMT. And in that case, it's the same kind of conversation that Jason was just having around, if you're lower than the 15% below the county average. And so if you picked county as your benchmark and then option 4, that's a little bit harder to explain why that's appropriate. That would be the same kind of case with your general plan build out VMT being higher than your existing VMT. It would be a little bit harder to justify how an increase in VMT would meet the legislative intent of SB 743. And that's really why we have to consider these options city by city. We're finding that each one is unique. Their data is telling us different things. And it's a different conversation city by city. And that is an important consideration.
But we are talking about running the future model and looking
Yes.
at the project VMT. We are not talking about that. Okay, if the future general plan, let's say VMT per service population or per capita, let's say the existing VMT is 20 miles, the future VMT is 18 miles. We are not talking about a 10% reduction from existing, but we're talking about comparing just the future, basically select zone VMT with the future VMT, correct?
Almost. We are comparing to the future VMT. That's correct. 2040, run the model, get the average VMT per service population at either the city or the county level. That's what we compare to. But we would run the project through the base year model and the future year model. We would compare the base year project result and the future year project result both with the 2040 average. So we have to look at baseline impacts and future year horizon year impacts. We have to look at both. Does that make sense?
Okay. Yeah. So if in a jurisdiction, let's say there's a 10% reduction between base year and future year, then under the existing conditions analysis, you would have an impact, and under cumulative, you would not have an impact?
Not necessarily. You'd have to run the project through the regional model to determine what the project VMT is, which is going to be different than your existing city average VMT or county average VMT, depending on your benchmark.
Yeah, so it's going to be project specific. Sandy, so much goes into what affects VMT, the diversity of your land uses, the density of your project, destination accessibility, all that really affects what your VMT ends up being. So I'm not sure it's a blanket statement that says if your general plan VMT goes down, that you'll have an impact in the near term. All that stuff plays into it. I will say that this is going to put a brighter spotlight on a lot of the tools, like our regional travel and modeling tools. And one of the things, in case you guys are not aware, is in the SCAG regional model, not the SBCTA model, but the SCAG, they've got a pretty high telecommute trip reduction.
Yep.
So the future year model VMT was always way, way lower than the base year. So there are certain assumptions like that as you're making these CEQA determinations, pre-COVID, we would always strip out that assumption as far as the telecommute, because we didn't think there was substantial evidence to support it if it ever got challenged. So, post-COVID, well, we're all telecommuting, I'm not sure. But it's something to consider and make sure you're paying attention to it with all the tools. And Delia, I think we've only got a couple minutes left, so yeah. Pretty much the end of the conversation, right? Or the presentation, or?
We did have a few slides on mitigations. I know that was an interest to the group. As Jason mentioned, we are basically at the end of our time, so we may not be able. I can stay on, a little bit after 12. I want to be respectful of others' time, though, if they do have to jump off. But that was the last topic that we were going to discuss would be mitigations today.
We'd definitely like to hang in there for just a brief overview of those remaining slides, please.
Sure. All right, so keeping
Actually, Delia, before you get started, Carlos, I do apologize. I have a 12 o'clock I have to get to, so I'm going to drop off, but we'll leave you in the capable hands of Delia and the SBCTA staff as well.
Thank you, Jason. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Jason. Great. Okay, so keeping it as brief as we can here with feasible mitigation. So SEQR requires that we attempt all feasible mitigation. So for VMT, that really means that we have to look at two different things. We can either change our built environment, or we can look at TDM, transportation demand management strategies. So the built environment changes are usually things that a project often can't do. So that is something like increasing the accessibility to local destinations. Not usually something that's easy to change. But TDM is project site specific. So how do we quantify VMT mitigation? We really have to rely on existing research from the Air Resource Board and CAPCOA. They have research on actual reductions associated with different mitigation measures. We also have to think about, too, with a lot of these measures, does it make sense to have a project or more of a programmatic approach? There's also a conversation to have around a mitigation fee program, a mitigation bank, a mitigation exchange. Those things we all describe in detail in the documents that we produced for SBCTA. And just to be clear, there are no VMT mitigation exchanges or banks currently in existence. This is something that a number of jurisdictions are considering. I believe SBCTA is going to launch a pilot program with some SCAG funding to look at what that might look like in the San Bernardino County region, but none of these have actually been implemented yet. So we did take a look in detail at the TDM measures that are outlined in CAPCOA and CARB research and identified the measures that we thought were most appropriate for San Bernardino County. So these are measures that may not be appropriate for every project, but this is just sort of the menu of measures that we found most applicable to San Bernardino County. And so those are listed here. Increase the diversity of land uses. So that means that if you are developing a residential project, you could introduce a commercial element to that project. You essentially introduce a mix of land uses into your project mix, provide pedestrian network improvements, pretty self-explanatory, provide traffic calming measures and low stress bicycle network improvements, again, pretty self-explanatory. Implement a car sharing program, increase transit frequency and speed, and provide ride sharing programs. Those are all things that would either require participation from a regional or local agency, a transit agency, or the tenants of the project. So there's some caveats to those as well. And then, as Jason just mentioned, telecommuting is something we're all doing right now. And again, depends on the tenants of the project being willing to participate in that measure, but is certainly, as we're all experiencing currently, an effective way to reduce VMT. So we did just want to provide some resources, some guidance documents that have already been adopted and put together. All of the WRCOG implementation work is available online. I believe the majority of the SBCTA memos, guidelines, sample resolution, I believe all of that material has been shared at this point. And then also just noting within the Inland Empire, we have two jurisdictions that have adopted their VMT guidelines, and that would be the County of San Bernardino and City of Corona. So that takes us to the end of our slides. Sorry, I went through that very quickly, just trying to be sensitive towards time there.
Thank you. For those remaining on the call, I'll just ask if you had any burning question you'd like to get out there before we.
I just have one question, Carlos. This is Joseph. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Regarding the TDM menu of options that are being considered for San Bernardino, would this be a one-time payment, or is this a in perpetuity contribution towards the TDM program?
Yeah, that is a great question. And that is one of those questions that sort of leads us to that discussion of a mitigation fee program, exchange, or bank, because a lot of these types of programs would require ongoing financial maintenance to maintain, something like a car sharing program. it is hard to imagine a situation where a fee would be imposed in perpetuity, which I think is why a mitigation fee program or mitigation bank is more appealing, because those in theory would operate as a one-time payment into that program or bank or exchange.
This is Delia. This is Josh. So to kind of looking into the future, what we're kind of considering at SBCTA is looking at some of these options. And since we don't have any programs at this point, because you can't take credit for things that you're already taking credit for, these would have to be a new programs. So we're in the next steps phase or phase 2. We're going to take a look at the some of the programs that are out there that Metro's kind of developing, LADOT and a few others in our state, and try to see if that could kind of apply to our San Bernardino County. And if it does, then we'll take a look at some of the quantification of those credits and see if we can do some exchange with it. But these will be all new programs in the future.
Yeah, thanks, Josh.
And Delia, one more question, if you don't mind. Is it
Sure.
possible to email your presentation to the team?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, we can send the slides out. No problem.
That'd be great.
Yeah.
Thanks, Carlos.
Sure.
Carlos?
Any other questions?
Yeah,
I had a couple of questions for SBCTA and also a favor from Delia. Will it be possible, Delia, to have a separate call about the modeling? Because I don't want to bore everybody on the BI with the nuances of the modeling.
Absolutely. We can have a very nerdy, in-depth modeling call anytime, Sandy.
Cool. Thank you. And question for Steve and Josh. For industrial projects in your guidelines, will it be possible to say something like the VMT from heavy trucks is not applicable under 743 because the intent was for reducing automobile traffic?
Yeah, so Delia, correct me if I'm wrong, but we did have a discussion on the truck traffic, right?
Yeah,
And the
that's
memo?
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and we do have the ability, the truck model is kind of a standalone model. Again, Sandy, we can get into this in our modeling call in a bit more detail, but we do have the ability to identify and strip out truck VMT when appropriate.
Right.
That is kind of an ongoing conversation on, you're absolutely right, we're reducing passenger vehicle miles traveled. And Jason also brought up the issue of interstate commerce. Do we have the right to regulate that under CEQA? Some really complicated questions there that I think we'll be digging into in a lot more detail on specific projects, but we have discussed that with SBCTA.
Okay. And then the other question I have is the LOS-based TIA.
Mm-hmm.
So if I have and again, we are primarily for general plan consistency and stuff. So let's say if I have a project in the city of Chino, which is in the boundary of or very close to, let's say, city of Chino Hills, if the city of Chino decides to go with a separate TIA outside of CEQA, would the analysis in the SBCTA guidelines, will it require analysis of intersections or segments or whatever in adjacent cities?
Yeah, so that's a great question, Sandy. We did kind of breeze past that step 6 on the decision checklist, but that is something that's up to the discretion of the cities of whether or not they still want to include some kind of level of service analysis in their guidelines. As you mentioned, that would not be used in any CEQA document other than to evaluate general plan consistency. It would not be used to evaluate significant impact. But cities can still, of course, they have the discretion to ask for additional information and ask for that study to look at level of service in their jurisdiction, and if they wanted to be a good neighbor and ask for some analysis in a neighboring jurisdiction, they can still do that. Again, it would be sort of divorced from the CEQA process to some extent. But yeah, most jurisdictions we're talking with, though, level of service is still something they're concerned about and that matters to them. And most will still be requiring some level of service analysis.
Yeah, and to just add on the Measure I programs, that the fair share built into the Measure I programs will not change.
Right.
So those won't be impacted by the 743 analysis.
Right. Now, is SBCTA also looking at some kind of a transit fee program for future, or is that not in the books yet?
No, it's not in the books yet. We'll look at all those TDMs, in the future.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So,
Cool. Thank you.
I'm not sure if that's what, this is Phil Burham, sorry. I'm not sure if that's what Sandyvan was just getting to, but sometimes you guys start talking over my head and I'm not that bright. But the big question obviously is the mitigation strategies, and you went through the different types of things that apply, but it's about May 1st and cities will have to be implementing July 1st. So if I'm looking to buy land and I want to do a master plan in Hesperia, how can I quantify a mitigation cost for that? Everything that you've gone through is very informative, but it doesn't get down to the nuts and bolts of the expense of it all.
Yeah.
So it effectively, land developers are kind of paralyzed waiting to see how this is implemented. So what is the timeline for confirming an exchange program or a mitigation bank with endowments? What is the county's timeline for identifying that and finalizing that? And will there be stakeholder participation in those conversations where you'll engage developers or landowners in the conversation?
Mm-hmm.
So I'll answer that question.
Please, yeah, Josh, I was going
to. Yeah, so the phase 2 will work with SCAG will start right after this, so it probably around summer. And when we do that, of course, we'll engage the stakeholders, and just as we did with GHG or VMT, we'll still reach out to Carlos and BIA and all the other stakeholders that are involved. So absolutely, we'll take your comments, and there's no way we can develop a program like this and not come up with the input and not taking inputs from everybody. The other part of it, in terms of CEQA, though, since there is no regional programs available at this point, you won't be required to per se mitigate to that level. So under CEQA, you'll have to mitigate to the level where it's feasible. So we just won't have any regional mitigations that you'll be bound by on your project at this point.
Well, that was exactly the case. So, and without holding everybody to the specific timeline, so if I had a tentative map that was going to be reviewed sometime, probably call it between July and September, and I don't, so I'm not being specific, I would study VMT and I would mitigate to the extent I could within my project, but there's no feasible offsite mitigation because there's no program.
Yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
That's correct.
So until something is adopted or implemented, could cities start adopting their own? No, because they'd have to have a program to apply it to, right?
Cities would have to. They could adopt. We have seen some cities thinking about adopting or adapting their existing fee programs to be VMT fee programs. But you're right. They would have to adopt something within their city. I don't see it so much in San Bernardino County, but in some of the surrounding counties, individual cities may adopt individual city fee programs.
Okay, and then Josh, you mentioned that you're going to really kind of start that in phase 2 this summer. Do you have any way to quantify a timeline for how long something like that would take to develop and implement?
So tentatively, we're kind of thinking about a year.
Okay.
So we'll start this summer and then probably end next year, summer-ish. And
you guys are running kind of. I had the benefit of having some time with Jason not long ago. So are you going to try to kind of run parallel with WRCOG's implementation?
Yes. Yes, okay. Absolutely. Yep.
Perfect. Thank you.
Any other questions?
This is William Sacrisi with Lennar. I do have one question. So the threshold or the effective date is July 1st, as Phil mentioned earlier. So for us to understand when is the latest that a CEQA document can be sent, is that at the time of hearing? Is that past the appeal period? What if we were to get really granular? Where up until what are we safe?
Technically, pointing back to one of our earlier slides, technically, if a document today only has level of service in it to make impact conclusions in the transportation chapter of your EIR, technically you're not 100% safe today, given that court decision that we discussed out of Sacramento, which indicated that as of November 2018, all CEQA documents should be including something other than level of service. Sorry, what was that?
That wasn't me. That was somebody else.
Okay.
Not
All right.
muted.
Understood. Yeah. So really, unfortunately, yeah, to be 100% safe, we're actually kind of past that point today. We are still kind of in a gray area between now and July 1st a little bit. You could use something other than VMT. You'd have to prove why that was an appropriate metric, but it can't be level of service.
Got it. But the threshold would have been the day of the hearing, the appeal period. What would you think is?
I would think it would be the day of the hearing where the EIR is
certified.
Certified,
Yeah.
yes. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay. Great. Thank you.
Hey, Delia, I think some jurisdictions are going with the day of circulation. So I think City of Riverside is saying that as long as your document is circulated prior to July 1st or the city adopting their thresholds, you don't have to do VMT.
Yeah, that is another interpretation. Again, 100% safe. I think there is no 100% safe right now, and I think everything probably should have VMT in it right now, just to be really covering yourself.
True. Yeah.
Thanks for that, Sandy.
Okay, anything else for the good of the order? I'll turn on my camera again to bid everyone a farewell, and I want to thank you, Delia. Please pass along our appreciation to Jason and Josh. Thank you so much for continued collaboration. Please give Steve Smith our best as well. We look forward to just this final request. We know that cities are smartly looking on a number of fronts to you, Delia, and Jason brought you guys on board to help them navigate through that. Would just respectfully request, as we've had this discussion today, to have that opportunity to get into the weeds and unpack some of the particulars, as these proposals are brand new. It'd be ideal to have those discussions before something is literally going to go before a planning commission, and just have that window as much as possible to have the input. So just if you could look at that process through that lens, we greatly appreciate it, and look forward to the opportunity to work with you.
Great. And thank you so much for having us. And on behalf of myself and Jason, we appreciate the opportunity to speak with everybody in the development community.
Appreciate the invaluable insights today, and at your convenience, if you could send us the link, I'm sure others who would be very interested in this information. So thank you again. We appreciate today's discussion.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Okay. Bye-bye.
All right.
Take care. Stay
Bye.
safe.
You too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thanks.
Thank you.